For some reason, my mum and dad just didn't want me to go. It was pouring with rain, and they were like, we don't want you going. We don't want you going in someone's car that we don't know. And we got in a big argument about it. Me being like, I want to go, I want to be young. You can't tell me what to do. We drive off to find somewhere to get some food. And the restaurant was closed. We just couldn't get any food. So it was a pointless trip.
One night, my brother Nick was in a car with his friends. They were driving down a dual carriageway. The road was wet, and the car span out, smashing into the central barrier. My brother and his friends, they started to get out of the car, and that's when another car came screaming down the road straight for them. My brother jumped out of the way just in time, but his friend Ben wasn't so lucky.
All I remember thinking is, my mum was right, I should not have come out tonight. Once I get out of the car, I'm now just standing in the right-hand lane. Unbeknown to anyone, was a nurse who was late for work, which again just makes it one of those wonderfully ironic things that you're going to get hurt by somebody who has dedicated their lives to helping people, who is late for work, speeding down the right-hand lane, and just hits me. Just is driving down the road, and that's it. She's hit me against the vehicle that I've got out of. So I've gone through her windshield, and then she's hit her brakes, and that has caused me to fly through the air 50 feet where the point of impact between her car and the car I got out of was. It was literally on my leg, which had, we'll go technical, had pretty much degloved my leg of its God-given skin. At that exact point when I got hit by that car, on the other side of the road was an ambulance. 2 of my arteries had been severed, so I was just bleeding to almost to death on the roadside. And luckily, if they wouldn't have been there, if they'd had to call an ambulance, then unfortunately for me, it would have been too late. And I would have gone off like a sad mouldy peach. So I went into hospital on the 20th, and my leg was amputated on the 27th of March 2008.
When I think of amputations, I think of surgeons trying to save a life on the operating table. But that's not how amputations first started. Cave paintings dating from around 36,000 years ago depict people cutting their own arms off, probably to try and appease some god. And in some cultures, amputation has been used as a punishment. Some would cut off a hand for stealing, or perhaps a leg for being lazy, although I don't know how that would help with being lazy. First evidence of a medical amputation comes from 4900 BC. The remains of a Stone Age man were found missing an arm, and the residual limb was shown to have evidence of surgery. And it's believed that this man went on to live a very healthy and happy life after having his arm cut off. But the first person to really get in there and experiment with amputations, if experiment is the right word, was Hippocrates in around 400 BC in Greece. He used to lop off people's limbs if they turned gangrenous, which, while a good idea in principle, most of his patients died. And things stayed pretty much the same for the next 2,200 years. People dying in really painful, hurriedly performed operations, until in 1849, when general anaesthetic was invented, and 1928, when penicillin was discovered. And also, doctors started sterilising all their instruments, which for some reason seemed to help.
And then I see the disinfectant. Is there a way we can do something like that by injection?
So now most people survive amputations, which has actually led to some odd developments. In 2000, Robert Smith had the headlines, and not that Robert Smith, a surgeon called Robert Smith. He was working in a hospital in Scotland and performed amputations on 2 people who didn't seem to actually need them. But why? These people were suffering from a really rare condition called body integrity identity disorder, where they believe that one of their limbs doesn't belong to them, that they should have been born without it. And this turns into an unquenchable need to amputate. Which can lead some people to take matters into their own hands. There have been cases of people using shotguns or chainsaws to mutilate themselves to the point that they need an amputation. Our brains are constantly building and rebuilding a virtual picture of our bodies. That's how we can sense what position our body is in without looking at it. This picture is built in the superior parietal lobe, but with people who have body integrity identity disorder, when the affected limb is touched, the superior parietal lobe doesn't react the way that it should do, which suggests that their virtual picture doesn't include the limb that they think doesn't belong to them, which leads to extremely distressing cognitive dissonance. Operations like the ones that Robert Smith performed were swiftly banned in the UK, but there are some people that think they should be offered on the NHS. What do you think? Leave me a comment below. Personally, I'm not too into it, but to each their own, I guess. So I was wondering, what would happen to your body if your arm was suddenly chopped off by accident? Well, the first and biggest problem is bleeding. But in most cases, the veins will actually go into spasm and retract into the wound, which will slow that bleeding or perhaps even stop it. But if that doesn't happen and there's no one around to run the wound under a cold tap or something, then as your blood leaks out, your blood pressure will start to drop and you could go into shock. And in fact, even if you do stop the bleeding, the emotional trauma could push you into shock too. Shock happens when your blood pressure drops so low that you don't get enough oxygen into your organs and they start to fail. The symptoms of shock include cold and sweaty skin, weak but rapid pulse, irritability, thirst, irregular breathing, anxiety, confusion, and nausea. Without treatment, shock usually kills. And if you manage to survive all that, what's left of your arm could actually kill you. If the wound isn't closed properly, it could lead to gangrene. Gangrene happens when the blood supply to your flesh is cut off and that flesh starts to die. There are a couple of different types of gangrene, but in the case of having your arm suddenly dismembered, the type of gangrene you're probably going to get is moist gangrene. And what happens in the affected area, the cells start to leak liquid, so it starts to swell and to reek. This liquid is a perfect petri dish for bacteria, which can then lead to sepsis. Sepsis is a real killer. In 2017, it's estimated that 11 million people died from sepsis. It's a case of your body's own defences working against you. As your body tries to fight the infection, it produces a load of inflammatory proteins called cytokines. And these cytokines, they have a bit of a nasty side effect. They tend to attack the cells that make up the lining of your blood vessels. Now, at first, your blood starts to clot to fill the holes, but this can lead to the entire vessel getting blocked completely. And then when your clotting agent runs out, blood and bacteria starts to leak into the area around it. On top of that, the cytokines make your blood vessels dilate, making them bigger. So as a result of all of this, your blood pressure drops, you go into shock, and you die. But it's not all bad news. If the cut is clean and the limb isn't too damaged and you manage to get to hospital without bleeding to death and you've preserved the limb properly, which means keeping it cold without putting it directly on ice because that gives it frostbite, then there's a good chance that a surgeon can reattach it. And even if they can't, legally, in a lot of places, you're allowed to take a limb home with you from the hospital, and that includes the UK and the US, which is nice. But honestly, you may not want your old-fashioned arm. Advances in modern prosthetics are amazing. You can get sensors implanted in your residual limb that control your prosthetic and also can send feedback to your brain, which tells you how much pressure you're putting on your mechanical fingers. People are 3D printing prosthetics at home and installing low-cost myoelectric sensors which key off muscle movement. We're getting closer and closer to the bionics of sci-fi fantasy every day.
The choice was, we can try to salvage a leg out of this. They would just essentially said, we're going to give you like a stick for a leg that won't really work, or we can amputate your leg. I remember being asked that question, and I remember being so happy to just say, like, just get rid of it. I think I laughed when he asked me. And I have a prosthetic knee, and it's a hydraulic knee, which means that it uses a hydraulic cylinder to create yield. These feet have got shock absorbers in them that deals with kind of downward pressure as you walk and run and jump. So if you're jumping off stuff, they're really good because when you land, it stops the impact being too much up into your body. The latest kind of one that's come out is called the X3 by Autobot, and it's amazing. It's 100% waterproof. You can go in and out the water with it. It will match the user's speed. Has a 5-day battery life. You can run with it, walk with it, swim with it, ski with it, snowboard with it. It's compressing all these uses into one limb.
Of course, in an ideal world, we'd all be able to keep our limbs intact, but sadly, that isn't the case. When Ben lost his leg, it was a tragedy, but he never let it get him down. He never got sad for himself over it. He taught himself how to skateboard again. He taught himself how to play drums again. 2 of his major passions. He kept his optimism and his sense of humour.
My mum bought me these brand new trainers. Wear your nice trainers if you're going out. So I wore these nice trainers. First time I ever wore them. One of the greatest details of this story is my brand new shoes are stood exactly where I was standing. That she hit me so hard that I got knocked out of my shoes. There are loads of elements to the story that are hilarious. I got knocked out of my shoes and you don't want to laugh at it. And you know what? Years later, I was at sixth form. I knew this kid, I kind of knew him, and he come up to me. He was like, Ben, I said, Ben, can we go sit somewhere? He went, look, man, I've got to tell you, my mum works at the hospital and she gets given all the clothing that's brought in from the patients because they have to cut them off and throw them away. When they brought you in, they brought in like your shoes, like this brand new pair of trainers. And I was like, oh right, yeah, I remember those shoes. Yeah, it's hilarious. I got knocked out of them. He was like, oh, she offered them to me. She brought them home and offered them to me because they were brand new. She didn't want them to go to waste. And I was like, why didn't she give them back to me? And he was like, well, she thought you lost your leg. You wouldn't need shoes. And you want to tell me that it's not funny? It's so good. Things can just happen sometimes that aren't great. You have no control over what happens to you. And sometimes people make mistakes. I was so grateful to look around me like every day when I'd wake up and see these nurses, doctors, porters. I just remember I remember looking back to it like it was like my college days because I was so grateful to just be alive.
My bad science videos are hardly ever this heartwarming in the end, so if you want to see more videos to be disgusted and creeped out, then hit the subscribe button. And if you have any subjects that you want me to cover, please leave a comment below this video. And until next time, try and keep hold of all your limbs.